March 1981, Oak Haven County. The wind had a name here. It was called the Scour, and it came from the northwest, across 300 miles of flat, tilled earth, with nothing to slow it until it hit the low rise of hills that marked the county's western edge. Arthur Pearsall's farm sat in the path of that wind, and the highest point on his land was a long, exposed ridge the old maps called Harrison's Brow, but which everyone in living memory had simply called the Bald Knob. It was 30 acres of punishment, a place where the topsoil had long ago given up and gone to live in the next state. Arthur Pearsall was 72 years old. He had been born in the clapboard house that stood a quarter-mile down from the knob, sheltered by a stand of ancient oaks his great-grandfather had left untouched. He was a man shaped by the land he worked, which is to say he was quiet, patient, and deeply grooved. His hands were maps of a life spent with wire, wood, and iron. His face was a testament to the sun and the scour. He did not speak often, and when he did, his words were like stones from his fields, hard, plain, and chosen with care. He had farmed this land for 50 years, since his father, Silas, had passed it to him. He was debt-free, a fact that was a quiet mystery and a source of low-grade irritation to the men at the Oak Haven Farmers Co-op. The Bald Knob was the farm's great failure. It was a long, slow wound on the landscape, a patch of pale, compacted clay mixed with shale that grew only thistle, mullein, and a tough, wiry grass that even the goats disdained in a dry year. In the spring, the rain washed down it in sheets, cutting gullies that bled brown water into the pasture below. In the summer, the sun baked it to the hardness of brick. In the fall and winter, the scour took what little was left, lifting the dust in ghostly plumes that could be seen from the county road. The problem was not new. It was a geological fact, a feature of the farm as permanent as the creek or the property lines. Its history was a catalog of defeats. Arthur's great-uncle Hiram, a man of boundless optimism and poor judgment, had tried to plant it in corn back in 1934. The seed had washed out in the first May storm. The soil that followed it had taken 2 decades to recover in the lower fields. In the 1950s, a neighbor, Tom Jessup, had leased it for grazing. His cattle, 50 head of Angus, had picked it clean in one season and compacted the ground so thoroughly that nothing but the hardiest weeds ever returned. Others had offered advice. The county had, at one point, suggested it be enrolled in a conservation program, which amounted to getting a small check to let it grow wilder and more useless. For decades, the Bald Knob had been accepted. It was the flaw in the heart of the Pearsall place, a part of the farm that was not a farm at all, but merely land to be driven past on the way to more productive acres. It was, everyone agreed, a lost cause. One Tuesday morning in April, a new white Ford pickup with the county seal on the door rolled up Arthur's Lane. It crunched to a stop on the gravel beside the barn. A young man stepped out. He was not more than 30, with a neat haircut and a pressed plaid shirt. He carried a stainless steel clipboard and an air of professional concern. His name was David Klein, and he was a new county extension agent, fresh from a state university with a degree in agronomy and a belief in the power of data. Klein had come to offer help. The county had a new soil conservation initiative funded by a federal grant, and he was making the rounds, assessing marginal lands and offering modern solutions. He had a file on the Pearsall farm. He had seen the topographical maps and the soil composition surveys from the 1960s. He knew all about the Bald Knob before he ever set foot on it. He found Arthur by the machine shed, greasing the bearings on a sickle bar mower. "Mr. Pearsall," Klein said, extending a clean hand. "David Klein, from the county extension office. I was hoping I could have a few minutes of your time." Arthur wiped his hand on a red rag before taking the young man's. His grip was firm, dry, and unhurried. "Arthur," he said. "Good to meet you, Arthur. I'm here about the new land stewardship program. We're looking to help landowners find productive and profitable uses for underperforming parcels. My files indicate you have a section of Class 4, possibly Class 5 land up on your northern boundary. The piece folks call the Bald Knob." Arthur nodded slowly. He pulled the rag through his fingers, his eyes on the young man's polished boots. Klein clicked his pen. "I took the liberty of pulling the data. We're looking at a silted clay loam with severe erosion. High wind exposure, poor water infiltration. The organic matter content is likely less than 1%. Frankly, the numbers aren't good. He wanted to walk the land. Arthur led him up the tractor path toward the ridge. Klein talked as they walked, a steady stream of technical terms and program acronyms. He spoke of wind velocity metrics, of subsidized seed mixes for ground cover, of terracing proposals that would require earth-moving equipment and significant capital investment, though grants could offset a portion of the cost. They reached the crest of the knob. The wind was steady, pushing at them, making Klein raise his voice. He kicked at a patch of bare earth with the toe of his boot. It was like kicking a stone. "You see," Klein said, gesturing broadly. "Classic desertification pattern. The wind shears off any new growth before it can establish. The rain can't soak in, so it just runs off, taking what little soil is left. It's a feedback loop." He consulted his clipboard. The official recommendation for a parcel like this would be the Conservation Reserve Program. We'd pay you a per-acre fee to take it out of production entirely. Plant it over with native grasses, let go back to scrub. It would stop the erosion, which is the main concern from a county perspective. It's the most cost-effective solution. Arthur looked out over the 30 acres. He did not see a feedback loop or a non-performing parcel. He saw the place where he had flown a kite as a boy, the long spine of land that caught the first light of morning and held the last of the evening. He remained silent. Klein mistook this silence for agreement, or perhaps resignation. "It's a tough piece of ground, Arthur. No shame in it. Some land just wasn't meant to be farmed. The best we can do is manage its decline." He smiled, a kind professional smile. "I can have the paperwork drawn up for you. It's a simple process." Arthur finally spoke. His voice was low, and the wind almost carried it away. "I was thinking of planting trees." Klein's smile faltered. He blinked. "Trees? Here." He looked around at the barren expanse, then back at Arthur, as if checking to see if the old man was serious. "Arthur, with all due respect, nothing will grow here. The wind would desiccate the saplings in a single season. They'd never establish a root system in this compacted clay. The university studies on afforestation in high wind, low-quality soil environments are very clear. The failure rate is over 90% without intensive and, I mean very expensive, irrigation and windbreak installation. You'd be throwing your money away." Arthur's gaze was fixed on the far end of the ridge. "I believe they'll grow." Klein's professionalism hardened into a mask of pity. He saw an old farmer, stubborn and out of touch, clinging to a foolish hope. He had seen it before. "Well," he said, his tone shifting, "it's your land, of course. You're free to do as you please. But the county can't subsidize a project with no chance of success. Our models just don't support it. If you change your mind about the CRP, my card is in the file I'll leave with you." He made a few more notes on his clipboard, a gesture of finality. The assessment was over. The expert had spoken. The next Saturday, Arthur drove his 1968 Chevrolet C10 into town for supplies. He stopped at the Oakhaven Farmers Co-op. The co-op was the town's nerve center, a place of worn wooden floors, the smell of fertilizer and cracked corn, and the slow, grinding turn of local gossip. Carl Draper, who managed the co-op, was behind the counter. Jebediah Stone and a few other farmers were leaning against sacks of feed, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. "Arthur," Carl said, a little too cheerfully, "heard the county boy was out to your place. Klein, is it? Full of bright ideas, that 1-inch. He was there," Arthur said, handing Carl his list. Jebediah, a man whose farm bordered Arthur's to the south, spoke up. "He came by my place, too. Wanted me to sign up half my pasture for some program. Told him my cows were doing a fine job of conserving it already." The other men chuckled. "What did he try to sell you on, Arthur? Terraces? Subsoiling?" Arthur did not look up from his list. "Trees," he said. "I'm planting trees on the knob." A silence fell over the group. It was the kind of silence that follows a statement so unexpected it requires a moment to be processed. Then Carl laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Trees? On the bald knob? Arthur, you've been out in the sun too long? Where are you going to plant him, Inrock?" Jebediah shook his head, a look of genuine concern on his face. "Now, Carl, leave him be. But Arthur, that boy Klein is right about one thing. Nothing's grown up there since the good Lord made it. My granddaddy said so, and his granddaddy before him. It's a fool's errand. The other men murmured in agreement. They were not being unkind, not in their own minds. They were being practical. They were farmers, and they knew the land. They knew what was possible and what was not. Planting trees on the Bald Knob was not possible. It was a waste of time and, more importantly, a waste of money. They saw Arthur not as a visionary, but as an old man slipping into eccentricity, a man whose good sense was finally wearing thin after a lifetime of hard work. They saw him as a project for their pity. Arthur paid for his supplies. He loaded the sacks of bone meal and lime into the bed of his truck. He did not argue or defend himself. He had not expected them to understand. Their knowledge was wide but shallow. They knew the top 6 inches of soil across the whole county. They knew market prices and rainfall averages. But they did not know the Bald Knob. Not the way he did. He did this quietly. He drove home, the chorus of their skepticism echoing in the cab of the truck, a sound as steady and meaningless as the wind. That evening, Arthur sat in his father's worn leather armchair. The sun went down, and the house grew dark around him, but he did not turn on a lamp. He was thinking of the past, of a time before the extension agents and their clipboards, before the soil surveys and the government programs. He was thinking of his father, Silas. The memory was as clear as the view from the knob on a crisp autumn day. He was 12 years old, standing on that same ridge with his father. The wind was blowing hard, just as it had today, making his eyes water. He had asked the question a boy would ask. "Pa, why doesn't anything grow here? Why is it so bare?" Silas Pearsall had not been a man of many words, but the ones he used were built to last. He had knelt, picking up a handful of the pale, gritty soil. He let the wind take it from his open palm. "Most people look at this place, and they see a problem," Silas had said, his voice calm and low. "They see the wind as the enemy. They see the poor soil. They think the answer is to fight it, to throw fertilizer at it, to plow it under, to try and force it to be something it's not." He had pointed out across the vast, flat expanse to the northwest. "That wind, son, it's traveled a long way. It's full of energy. People think that energy is destructive, and it is if you just stand in its way. But you can also make it work for you." He had looked at his son, his eyes serious. "The wind isn't the enemy, Arthur. It's the engine. You just have to build a machine." That was the principle. It was the core of the knowledge that had been passed from his father to him. It was a truth so simple and so profound that it was invisible to men like David Klein, who saw the world through a lens of problems to be solved with products and programs. Silas had not seen a problem to be solved. He had seen a system to be understood. After a time, Arthur rose and went to the old secretary desk in the corner of the room. From the bottom drawer, he removed a book. It was a ledger bound in dark brown leather, the cover worn smooth with time. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, a neat, dense script in faded black ink. It was not a diary. It was a record. Silas had kept meticulous notes on the farm for over 40 years. There were pages detailing rainfall, measured in a can on a fence post. There were charts of crop rotations, yields, and commodity prices. There were sketches of fence lines and drainage ditches. But the largest section, nearly a third of the book, was dedicated to the Bald Knob. Arthur sat at the kitchen table and opened the journal. The pages smelled of old paper and dust. Here was the physical manifestation of his father's knowledge. It was all there. Decades of observation. Notes on the subtle shifts in the wind's direction with the changing seasons. Temperature readings taken at the crest of the ridge and at its base, showing a consistent differential. Soil tests, done not in a lab, but by hand, judging texture, color, and composition. Silas had dug test holes all over the knob. His notes from 1938 described the soil profile. Top 2 inches, pale clay, hard as pan. 2 to 10 inches, heavier clay, some shale. Below 10 inches, a deep layer of fractured shale, but holding moisture. The water isn't running off. It's running through just below the surface. Another entry from 1942, walked the knob after the big thaw. The south face holds the snow drifts longest. The ground there is softer, more life in it. The northwest face is scoured clean. And then, near the back, a series of drawings. They were plans, a pattern of staggered lines, like waves breaking on a shore. Beside the drawings were lists of trees, not the fast-growing hybrids that modern nurseries sold, but older, tougher varieties. Black locust, Osage orange, Austrian pine, white spruce. For each, Silas had made notes. Black locust fixes nitrogen. Its roots will break the hardpan. It will feed the others. Osage orange, thorny, dense, will grow in pure clay. The toughest windbreak there is Austrian pine, holds its needles, will catch the snow in winter. It was a complete system, a machine designed to harness the wind. The outer rows, the toughest trees, would blunt the force of the scour. Their density would create a zone of calm behind them. In that calm, the snow would settle instead of blowing away. In the spring, that snow would melt and soak into the ground, captured by the deep roots of the trees. The roots would break up the compacted clay, allowing water to penetrate deeper. The falling leaves and needles would create a new layer of organic matter, a new topsoil, year after year. The black locust would fertilize the soil from below. Each part of the system supported the others. The machine would build itself. It was a plan born of decades of patient observation, a solution that worked with the nature of the place, not against it. It was slow. It was quiet. It required faith and an understanding of time that was measured in seasons, not quarters. Arthur closed the book. He had his father's notes. He had his father's wisdom. He had the memory of his father's voice. He knew what he had to do. The work began the following Monday. Arthur did not hire a crew. He did not rent heavy equipment. He drove his tractor from the machine shed. It was a 1958 Massey Ferguson 35, a small, tough, reliable machine he had owned for 20 years and maintained himself. The red paint was faded to a soft rose, and the engine had a particular rhythm he knew as well as his own heartbeat. On the three-point hitch at the back, he mounted a post-hole auger. It was a heavy, greasy piece of equipment, just as old as the tractor, but its 9-inch spiral bit was sharp and its gearbox was sound. He started on the northwest face of the knob, the side that took the full force of the scour. He did not simply start digging. He began by laying out the first row. He used what he had, a ball of orange baling twine and a bundle of wooden lath stakes. He hammered a stake into the ground at the far western edge of the ridge. He walked a straight line, 200 paces his long, deliberate stride, eating up the distance, and hammered another stake. He tied the twine between them, pulling it taut until it hummed in the wind. This was his guide. Then he began to drill the holes. He positioned the tractor, lowered the auger, and engaged the power takeoff. The auger bit into the hard ground. The tractor's engine groaned under the load. Pale, dry clay and chips of shale spiraled up out of the earth. He drilled down 3 feet, deeper than a commercial tree planter would have bothered with. He knew from his father's journal that the moisture was down deep. He had to give the roots a path to find it. When the hole was dug, he backed the tractor up 10 feet and drilled another. He worked all day. The rhythm was slow and steady. Position the tractor. Lower the auger. Engage the PTO. Watch the soil come up. Raise the auger. Drive forward 10 feet. Repeat. By the end of the day, he had a single, perfectly straight row of holes, 60 of them, marching across the face of the wind. The community watched. His nearest neighbor, Jebediah Stone, saw the old Massey Ferguson crawling back and forth on the ridge and shook his head. Drivers on the county road slowed down, curious about the strange activity on the barren hill. The news traveled back to the co-op. "He's really doing it," Carl Draper reported to the morning coffee drinkers. "Got the tractor up there with the auger. Looks like he's digging to China." The consensus was that it was a sad spectacle. The old man was spending his last years and his good money on a fantasy. David Klein, the extension agent, drove by one afternoon. He saw the solitary tractor, the neat row of holes. He did not stop. He felt a pang of something like pity, but it was quickly replaced by the certainty of his own professional judgment. The old man was proving his point for him. It was a waste of fuel, a waste of time. The models were clear. Arthur ignored them all. He He was not performing for an audience. He was engaged in a quiet, methodical conversation with the land. For the rest of the week, he drilled holes. He did not plant in a simple grid. He followed the staggered pattern from his father's journal. The second row was offset from the first, its holes positioned to cover the gaps. The third row was offset from the second. The design was meant to create maximum turbulence, to trip the wind and force it to drop its load of dust and snow, to break up its smooth, destructive flow. He laid out 10 rows, a deep band of defense on the northwest side. In total, he drilled 600 holes. Each one was a statement of intent. When the digging was done, the planting began. He did not simply place the saplings in the holes. First, he had to amend the soil. Beside his barn stood a compost pile that he had tended for years. It was not a simple heap of refuse. It was a carefully managed ecosystem. It contained manure from the single dairy cow he kept, spoiled hay from the loft, sawdust from his workshop, kitchen scraps, and tons of leaves he collected each fall from the ancient oaks by the house. He turned it regularly with a pitchfork, keeping it aerated and active. The result was a dark, rich, sweet-smelling humus, alive with worms and microbes. He loaded his small utility trailer with this black compost, along with sacks of bone meal for phosphorus and crushed limestone to balance the soil's pH. He hitched the trailer to the tractor and drove it up to the knob. At each hole, he shoveled in a mixture of his own creation. He worked his way down the rows, giving each future tree a small pocket of fertility, a welcoming bed in the hostile clay. It was backbreaking work, slow and repetitive. He filled the wheelbarrow, pushed it to the hole, dumped the mixture, spread it with a spade, and returned for another load. 600 times. The saplings came next. He had ordered them months before from the state forestry nursery. They were not impressive specimens. They were bare root whips, most no thicker than a pencil, bundled in damp burlap. To anyone else, they looked like sticks. But Arthur had chosen them carefully from the list in his father's journal. For the first 3 rows, the ones that would face the wind, he planted Osage orange and Austrian pine. The Osage orange, with its thorns and dense, interlocking branches, would form an impenetrable wall. The pines, with their year-round needles, would provide constant cover. The next 4 rows were black locust. This was the heart of the machine. Their roots, nodules teeming with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, will be the engine of renewal for the soil itself. They would not just grow in the poor soil, they would actively improve it for everything that came after. The final 3 rows, on the leeward side of the windbreak, were white spruce. They were slower growing, but would provide dense, long-term cover, creating a deep zone of calm where a new microclimate could be born. He planted with immense care. He had a 50-gallon barrel of water on the trailer, and he soaked the roots of each sapling before it went into the ground. He made sure the roots were spread out, not tangled. He gently backfilled each hole, tamping the soil down with his boot to eliminate air pockets. He worked his way across the ridge, tree by tree, row by row. It took him another 2 weeks. When he was finished, 600 thin, bare sticks stood in precise, staggered rows on the bald knob. To a casual observer, it looked like a child's haphazard project, a frail and foolish gesture against the vast, empty sky. To Arthur, it looked like the future. The first year was a trial. The spring was wet, which gave the saplings a good start. The roots began to push down, seeking the moisture he knew was there. But then came the summer, hot and dry. The clay on the knob baked hard around the young trees. Arthur did not have an irrigation system. He had the 50-gallon barrel on his trailer. Twice a week, all through July and August, he drove the tractor and trailer up the ridge. He gave each of the 600 saplings a gallon of water, ladled by hand from bucket. It was a slow, arduous process. Jebediah Stone watched him from his own fields, a tiny figure moving methodically along the rows, and felt a deep, sorrowful pity. The man was watering sticks in a desert. Then came the first winter, and with it, the scour. The wind howled across the ridge for days on end. It picked up the snow from the fallow fields to the northwest and threw it at the knob. David Klein, driving the county road during a lull in the storm, saw the ridge blasted by wind and spindrift. He thought of the tiny trees and shook his head. Desiccation, he thought. Windburn. They won't stand a chance. But the trees were not just standing in the wind. They were interacting with it. The staggered rows, even as thin whips, disrupted the airflow. The wind, forced to weave through the pattern, slowed down. As it slowed, it dropped the snow it was carrying. Instead of being scoured clean, the ground between the saplings began to accumulate a thin, protective blanket of white. The Austrian pines, with their needles, were particularly effective, each one creating a small drift on its leeward side. When spring came, the evidence was there for anyone who cared to look closely enough. On the surrounding land, the snow had melted quickly, and the ground was hard and dry. But within the plantation on the knob, the snow lingered for an extra week. The drifts melted slowly, their water seeping directly into the ground around the roots of the young trees. Arthur walked the rows. He had lost some trees, about 10%, which was better than he had hoped. The Osage orange were all thriving, their tough, green shoots defiant. The pines were stressed, some of their needles browned by the wind, but they were alive. The black locust, spindly and frail-looking, had taken root. He replaced the dead saplings and continued his work. The second year, the changes became more visible. The trees, their roots now established, put on a surprising amount of growth. The Osage orange and black locust grew especially fast, some reaching waist-high. A fine, green fuzz began to appear on the ground between the rows. It was clover and vetch, their seeds carried in on the wind or dormant in the soil for years, now finding enough moisture and shelter to germinate. The black locusts were already beginning their work, leaking nitrogen into the soil, feeding the plants around them. By the end of the third year, the machine was clearly working. The trees were now taller than a man. The outer rows of pine and Osage orange were beginning to knit together, forming a real barrier. Walking into the plantation from the northwest was like stepping from a storm into a quiet room. The force of the wind was broken, transformed into a gentle, swirling breeze. The ground was no longer bare clay. A thin layer of decaying needles and leaves was forming a nascent topsoil. The clover was thick, and in the summer, it hummed with the sound of bees. Birds, which had never found reason to visit the knob, were now nesting in the dense branches of the pines. The talk at the co-op began to change. The outright mockery faded, replaced by a grudging curiosity. "You see what Arthur's done up on the knob?" Jebediah Stone said one morning, stirring his coffee. "It's green up there. I mean actually green." Carl Draper nodded. "Drove by yesterday. Can't hardly see through those first rows anymore. Looks like a proper woodlet." The men still didn't fully understand it. They attributed it to luck, or to Arthur's legendary stubbornness finally wearing down the resistance of the land itself. They could not see the underlying principle, the system at work. They saw the result, but the process remained a mystery, a piece of Pearsall eccentricity that had, against all odds, paid off. David Klein saw it, too. He had been promoted to senior agent, and his work now involved more paperwork and fewer farm visits. But he still drove through the county, and he could not help but notice the transformation on the ridge. The pale scar on the landscape was healing over with a deep, healthy green. The lines on his topographical maps and the numbers on his soil surveys said it was impossible, but the evidence was right there, growing taller every year. He felt a prickle of professional unease. His models, his data, his entire education had been unequivocally wrong. The thought was unsettling. He pushed it aside. It was an anomaly, a fluke. It had to be. The final vindication came in the 5th year. It was a brutal winter, one of the worst in memory. Heavy snow in January was followed by a sudden thaw in February, which saturated the top layer of soil across the county. Then came a hard freeze, locking that moisture in. And then, in early March, the scour returned with a vengeance. For 3 straight days, the wind blew at a sustained 40 miles an hour, with gusts up to 60. But this time, it was not carrying snow. It was carrying soil. The frozen, saturated topsoil of the surrounding farms had thawed just enough on the surface to be vulnerable. The wind began to lift it, first as a fine dust, then as a thick black cloud. It was a dust storm in late winter, a black blizzard that stripped the topsoil from thousands of acres of unprotected fields. The storm was a catastrophe for Oak Haven County. When the wind finally died down, the damage was immense. Topsoil was piled in deep, black drifts against fence lines, barns, and houses. Fields were scoured down to the pale, unproductive subsoil. It would take years and thousands of dollars in fertilizer and amendments to bring them back. The county declared an agricultural state of emergency. During the storm, Arthur had stayed inside, listening to the wind howl. He did not worry. He trusted the machine. The day after the wind stopped, he walked up to the knob. The air was still hazy with dust. To the north and west, his neighbors' fields were a disaster, landscapes of pale clay and dark drifts. But his land was different. As he approached the woodlet, the ground was stable. The trees had done their job. The wind had hit the outer wall of pines and Osage orange and been forced upward over the top of the plantation. The 30 acres behind the windbreak had been protected, an island of calm in the midst of the gale. The snow that had fallen earlier in the winter was still there, a clean, white blanket tucked in among the trees. The ground beneath it was soft and damp, not frozen hard. The thick layer of pine needles and decaying leaves had acted as insulation. The clover was flattened but alive. No soil had been lost. In fact, soil had been gained. A fine layer of dark dust, topsoil from his neighbors' farms, had settled out of the turbulent air on the leeward side of the woodlet, a gift from the wind. The machine had not only protected his land, it had enriched it. A week later, David Klein's white county pickup once again drove up Arthur's Lane. Klein looked older than he had 5 years before. His face was etched with the stress of managing the county's disaster relief efforts. He got out of the truck, but this time he did not carry a clipboard. He approached Arthur, who was splitting firewood by the barn, with a different air about him. The professional certainty was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. "Arthur," Klein began, his voice low, "I've been driving all over the county for the past week. I've seen hundreds of fields. They're all destroyed, but yours, I saw it from the road. The pasture below the knob is untouched. There are no drifts. The soil is all there." Arthur stopped, resting his axe on the chopping block. He waited. Klein looked up at the ridge, at the dense, dark green wall of trees that now stood a good 20 feet tall. "I've been looking at the aerial survey photos. Your property is a green square in a brown map. Everyone around you lost inches of topsoil. You lost nothing." He paused, then looked directly at Arthur. "I was wrong. Everything I told you 5 years ago, everything I learned in school, it was wrong. I came here today because I need to understand." "How did you know?" There was no triumph in Arthur's eyes. There was no, "I told you," so there was only a quiet stillness. He did not answer with words. Instead, he motioned for Klein to follow him. He led the young man into the house, to the old secretary desk. He took out his father's leather-bound journal and laid it on the kitchen table. He opened it to the section on the bald knob. He pointed to the drawings of the staggered rows, to the lists of trees, to the decades of observations. Klein leaned over the book, his eyes scanning the faded ink. He saw the notes on wind direction, the soil moisture tests, the patient, meticulous accumulation of knowledge. It was data, but of a different kind than he was used to. It was not gathered from a satellite or a lab. It was gathered by a man's hands and a man's eyes over the course of a lifetime. "My father taught me," Arthur said, his voice filling the quiet kitchen. He saw this place differently. Everyone saw the wind as the problem. He saw it as the engine. He knew that if you built the right kind of machine, the wind would do the work for you. It would bring the moisture in winter. It would protect the soil. It would even bring new soil. He explained the system, plainly and without adornment. He described the function of each type of tree. The Osage orange as the shield, the pine as the net, the black locust as the fertilizer factory, the spruce as the final blanket. He explained how the staggered rows created turbulence, how the roots broke the hardpan, how the falling leaves created a new soil layer. Klein listened, his face a mask of intense concentration. He was not just hearing an explanation. He was receiving an education. The principles were so simple, so elegant, and so completely outside the scope of his formal training. His agronomy degree had taught him how to amend soil with chemicals, how to fight pests with pesticides, how to maximize yield in a single season. It had taught him how to impose a system on the land. It had never taught him how to listen to the land and discover the system that was already there. I was wrong, Klein said again, and this time it was a full admission, a confession. I came here with my spreadsheets and my soil maps, and I told you what was impossible. But I never really looked at the land. I only looked at my data about it. Your father, he looked at the land. Arthur simply nodded. Klein spent an hour with the journal. He took out a small notebook from his shirt pocket and began to take his own notes, copying the diagrams, the tree lists, the core principles. He was no longer the expert advising the farmer. He was the student learning from a master. Before he left, he stood by his truck and looked at Arthur. What you've done here, it's not just a solution for your farm. It's a solution for the whole county. For every farm that sits in the path of the wind. We spend millions on emergency relief after storms like this. We could be spending thousands on prevention, on planting trees like this. He looked determined. I'm going to write a new report, a new proposal for the county board. I'm going to call it the Pearsall method. With your permission, of course. I want to use your father's plans, your work here, as a model. We can create a new kind of conservation program, one based on this. We can pay farmers to build these systems on their own land. It was the beginning of a systemic change. The knowledge that had been confined to a single leather-bound book and the mind of one quiet old man was about to be adopted, codified, and spread across the county. The lesson learned on the bald knob would ripple outward, changing the landscape for generations to come. In the years that followed, the Pearsall Woodlet became a local landmark. It was no longer the bald knob. It was a thriving 30-acre forest. The trees were now 40 feet tall, a dense and complex ecosystem. The soil beneath them was rich and black, inches deep with humus. In the sheltered zone behind the woodlet, Arthur's pastures were lusher and more productive than ever before. The wind, the old enemy, had been transformed into an ally, a guardian. The trees, the machine he had built, stood as a quiet, living testament to his father's wisdom. It was no longer remarkable. It was simply true. One cool autumn afternoon, years later, Arthur walked the woodlet with his grandson, Leo. The boy was 16, quiet and observant like his grandfather. He had spent his summers on the farm, learning its rhythms. Arthur carried the old leather journal. They stood in the heart of the forest, the wind a soft whisper in the pine boughs high above them. Sunlight dappled the forest floor. They called you crazy for this, didn't they? Leo asked, his voice soft. Arthur smiled, a rare and gentle thing. Some did. They couldn't see it. They only saw what was. They didn't see what could be. He handed the journal to his grandson. This is for you. It's not about this piece of land. Not really. It's about a way of looking, a way of understanding. Your great-grandfather wrote it down, and I built it. Now it's your turn to learn it. Leo took the book. He opened it, his young fingers tracing the old, faded script. He was not just being given a book. He was being given a legacy. He was the successor, the next link in a chain of knowledge, of patience, of deep and abiding respect for the land. He looked up from the page, at the towering trees, at his grandfather's weathered face, and he understood. Some things do not become obsolete. They do not rust or wear out. They are not replaced by newer, faster models. They are principles. They are truths written not in textbooks, but in the soil, in the wind, and in the slow, patient growth of a tree. They just wait for people to remember why they were planted.